Hey there folks, welcome to Spectrum Pulse. We talk about music, movies, art, and culture. And today we're going to be talking about the debut album from Porter Robinson, titled Worlds. You know, it's one of the unspoken truths of synthpop that if your instrumentation and your production is good enough, your lyrics won't matter. Hell, you can say that's true about the majority of pop music, but you know what, synthpop is probably one of the more egregious offenders, mostly because of its history and its lineage. Now, throughout its early years in the late 70s and the early 80s, and especially with its breakthrough with new wave with the rise of MTV, synthpop could get by through keeping its instrumentation and its image very edgy and cool, or at least weird, and deeper substance going beyond that, well, honestly, that was just a bonus. Now, keep this in mind. I don't exactly think this is a bad thing. If you're not a good lyricist, it's probably best to keep that whole thing simple or minimalized and focus on the elements that will at the very least be able to get people to get up and dance. But as a critic who appreciates when lyrics inform some of the context and the emotion, it means that I don't tend to have a lot to really talk about and review when discussing some of these albums, especially those emerging from the EDM scene. And thus, I was a little bit wary in discussing Porter Robinson, a producer and DJ signed to Skrillex's record label and who got sick of playing mainstream EDM where he made his name, and he wanted to change things up a little bit. Now, I don't mind this. I don't mind the step away from EDM towards more of a synth-pop background, but some of Porter Robinson's main influences did make me a little bit cautious. For one, he claimed to draw a lot of his influences from the high-energy J-pop scene and from anime, both of which I know and have a passing knowledge of, but can't really say I'm a huge fan of either of them if I'm being completely honest. But then again, I'm always willing to try new things, and I did mostly like that 100 Waters release, The Moon Rang Like a Bell, on Skrillex's label earlier this year, so I figured what the hell, and I gave Worlds by Porter Robinson a chance. What'd I find? Well, okay, after a few listens, I can say this definitively. Worlds by Porter Robinson might just be the poster child of music that I can say is not for me in nearly every shape and form. Seriously, from the instrumentation to the vocals to the production to the very sparse scattering of not so oblique lyrics, this record is the sort of album that upon repeated listens gets the exact opposite of the reaction that it's trying to evoke. That said, even though it's not my thing at all, is it bad? Honestly, no, and that's part of the problem really, because I can definitely see this record finding some audience. It's just that said audience does not include me. But then I ask myself this question: what's the issue here? Why don't I like this? I mean, I like synthpop, and you get a good melody going. I can even like most EDM. Hell, with the sweeping, almost maximalist production and some of the lighter tones, I was reminded a fair bit of a few trance acts that I like, or even Owl City or M83 and Passion Pit, three acts that I mostly tolerate most of the time. And when you take a look at some of the melodic compositions, the resemblance starts becoming really uncanny. Porter Robinson really wears a lot of his influences on his sleeves. Decidedly pop melodies, gentle interludes on these stripped back keyboards, complementing the auto-tune with some Vocaloids in order to enhance that very synthetic appeal, all of it with a very certain sensibility and tone that can be described with one word: twee. Now, okay, I've talked before in my St. Vincent review how that particular brand and tone for indie pop tends to wear on me extremely quickly, but you know what, I'll confess that Porter Robinson's brand of it lasted a little bit longer than I was expecting, mostly through playing it through a very childlike sensibility in its lyrics and melodies that recalled a lot of sincerity and definitely recalled its anime influences. The keyboard tones, they're very clean, the glitchiness is confined to the chiptune segments, and with the exception of the vocals, the production just manages to crank everything up to 11 for that EDM-inspired, very danceable, very heavy chorus. Now, albums in this vein live and die by their melody lines, especially the guest vocals are mostly situated to the back of the mix and rendered are practically anonymous thanks to vocal effects, as they are here. And you know, to his credit, Porter Robinson does manage to pull together some pretty decent melody lines that I did like. I like the shimmering keyboard riff that drives Sad Machine, the decent enough, if a little bit conventionally sounding chords on Hear the Bells, but the convention's executed well, so no issue there. The gentle, understated arrangement at the beginning of the absolutely gorgeous song Sea of Voices that probably could have transitioned better into that pounding beat if I'm being honest. The rich string arrangement that very jarringly leaps into a static saturated choppy mess on Fellow Feeling that sounded like as if somebody tried to mash up Lindsey Sterling with clipping and completely screwed it up. And finally, this really rich symphonic swell that comes across on Goodbye to a World that honestly came across pretty damn effectively if it wasn't for that heavy beat driving driving through the back of it. And really by now you should all see the problem here. Porter Robinson is a very good producer when it comes to controlling his layers and crafting some pretty interesting soundscapes. But at the same time, his need to inject these pounding EDM-inspired dance beats into so many of these songs adds a lot of heaviness that does not really balance well with the very twee, very innocent tone. And that's not even touching on when he adds distortion or chops up these beats more aggressively, as he sometimes does, really letting the songs build any sort of substantial atmosphere. If he's gonna use some synth tones on this album that frequently feel flat and oily and not all that flattering, and not in the good way that some chiptune can be, at least he could do is give them more of a chance to breathe. And yet that does not happen either, as many of these mixes feel so overstuffed and overloaded with these squealing, whirring, whining effects that only peripherally contribute to the melody in that way that definitely shows most of its J-pop influences. But okay, putting the instrumentation aside, believe it or not, I can't believe I'm saying this, but as much as I said that lyrics don't really matter in synthpop, Porter Robinson actually manages to craft a loosely coherent theme lyrically on this album. Many of the songs feature iconography and metaphors and symbols about being very small and alone in a much larger, much more oppressive world that you don't always quite understand, with circumstances to change things so far out of reach, at least on this planet, and only by sticking together providing the slightest hint of actual relief. And honestly, that sincere vulnerability is believably conveyed by many of the singers, most thanks to the production situating them a little bit deeper throughout the back of the mix, and you know what, I'll describe it, keeping things a little bit cute, for lack of a better word. And while the songwriting is really boilerplate, it's reasonably well structured, and it does lend this album a bit of really distant humanity, which is kind of impressive for an album that uses so much synthetic voice effects. And hell, I'd even argue that sometimes it can really support that driving heaviness as this implacable world bears down on them. But then comes Goodbye to a World, where the distorted narrator says goodbye and flies away, promising to craft a new, less oppressive world, promises abruptly cut off, leaving this album on a very sharp moment of anticlimax. So okay, not only was the solution to run away from that implacable world instead of stand and fight or try to change it, but it's capped off with an aborted promise that seems to just leave us all behind. Does anyone else feel like if The Wizard of Oz just ended when the wizard flies away in his balloon, leaving Dorothy alone in Oz with no way to know how to possibly even get home? Okay, alright, putting that aside, look, this album, it's harmless, but it's not the sort of record that resonates with me in the slightest, either in its resolution or in its sound. And the more I think about it, the less I like this album. Sure, there are a few colorful melody lines, and I like how the lyrical conceit was executed mostly, but it really feels like Porter Robinson gives the tracks enough room to breathe or develop to really highlight those melodies, undercutting every single moment of subtlety on this album. On top of that, his background in EDM definitely shows his maximalist aesthetic, which might reflect some of his J-pop inspiration, but here it comes across as overstuffed, overdone, and considering most of this album runs really long for its lyrical subject matter and its instrumental ideas, more than a little bit exhausting. Now, you know what? I get why some people will like this sort of music. If you're into J-pop and EDM, it's probably much closer up your alley than it is for me. But honestly, for me, it's a 5 out of 10, and an extremely tentative recommendation at that. Porter Robinson might have shown his kawaii view of the world, but it's not the world for me, and you know what? I'm okay with that. So yeah, thanks a lot for watching. If you'd like to like and subscribe, I'd be more than grateful. If there's anything else I might be able to do to improve my presentation, or if there's any other albums coming out that you want me to take a look at, I'd be more than happy to give them a listen. Until then, I'm Mark, you're watching Spectrum Pulse, and I'll see you next time.